"Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews says, let my people go.'" The Exodus began in the ancient city of Ramses, also known as Tel el-Dabba. From there, the Israelites embarked on their journey into the wilderness for 40 years. The path they took, and the precise location of Mount Sinai and the sea crossing remain subjects of intense speculation. Identifying Yam Suf, the body of water the Israelites crossed, will help us determine the Exodus route. Its meaning has been debated extensively, with interpretations ranging from Sea of Reeds to End Sea. Its ambiguity allows for a potential crossing at either the Red Sea itself or its eastern extension known as the Gulf of Aqaba. The answer to this question will help us learn the location of Mount Sinai, which is described by the 1st century historian Josephus as the highest of all mountains thereabout, and by Philo as the loftiest and most sacred mountain in the district. The Central Sinai route is the newest proposal that was introduced by Wyatt in 1984. Wyatt proposed that the Israelites travel through the Sinai Peninsula and down the eastern coastlands to Nuweiba Beach, as he believes that the Red Sea crossing took place at the Gulf of Aqaba. From there, they would have crossed a submerged land bridge into Arabia, where Mount Sinai is identified as Jebel al-Lawz, which is the tallest mountain in northwest Saudi Arabia, with an elevation of 2,600 meters above sea level. The first reason for this theory is the argument that the Sinai Peninsula was part of Egypt. Therefore, the Israelites must have needed to cross the Gulf of Aqaba in order to escape the country. Then, in Exodus chapter 3 verse 1, it states that Moses came to Horeb, the mountain of God. As the majority of scholars believe that Horeb and Sinai refer to the same mountain, the most accurate location for a biblical Mount Sinai would be Midian, and the tallest peak that sits in the heart of the Midian mountains is Jebel al-Lawz. These clues from the Old Testament are supported by perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence from the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. In his letter to the Galatians, he declares that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. Moving on to the physical evidence, the mountain ranges on the western shore of the Gulf of Aqaba could have been why the Israelites were trapped between the approaching army and the Red Sea. This led to the miraculous parting of the water, which allowed the Israelites to cross unharmed, while Pharaoh and the Egyptian army were completely destroyed. Wyatt claims that the chariots and wheels can be seen along the sea floor of the Gulf of Aqaba. The final piece of evidence is the burnt rock on the peak of Jebel al-Lawz. This correlates to the description given in the book of Exodus. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord ascended on it with fire. The northern Sinai route proposes that Yam Suf refers to Lake Sabonis, or a similar body of water near the Mediterranean coast. Therefore, Mount Sinai will be located at Jebel el-Halal, which is 9-10 meters above sea level. Is the tallest mountain of the Qasem Ari range. Although this follows the traditional route between Egypt and the Levant known as the Way of the Philistines, it would have been heavily fortified by the Egyptians, and there is a chance that Lake Sabonis may not have existed during this time. The Bible also states that when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter, for God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. Given these flaws, the northern way is the least likely option. The last route is the most traditional one. It proposes that the Israelites crossed a shallow body of water, like the Bitter Lakes, before heading down the mining route along the west coastlands. Then, they turned east and headed towards Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses, which is one of the tallest in Egypt, with an elevation of 2,285 meters above sea level. The biblical chronology supports a shorter journey to the sea crossing, as it is only covered in Exodus chapter 14, with a longer trek to Mount Sinai, covered in chapters 16 to 18. Another reason for this route is that the Egyptians had to constantly guard their Sinai outposts from marauding tribes and indigenous Arabs. Since the Israelites are attacked by the marauding Amalekites once they cross the Red Sea in Exodus 17, this proposal would therefore fit well with this account. The first point refers to the argument that the Sinai Peninsula was part of Egypt. Now, Egypt did have a handful of frontier mining outposts in the Sinai Peninsula, similar to those found in Canaan. However, Canaan was never considered part of Egypt, so neither should the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, but what about the connection between Mount Sinai and Midian? The Bible does not explicitly state that Mount Sinai was in Midian. When describing Moses' journey to Mount Sinai, also called Horeb, the text indicates that he travelled a considerable distance. Exodus chapter 3 verse 1 states that Moses led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Other translations render this as the backside of the desert, or the rear part of the wilderness. The Hebrew term used suggests a remote or hindered place and can even mean west, as seen in the Revised Standard Version. This aligns with the traditional location of Mount Sinai. Another point to add here is that Exodus 18 recounts how the Israelites, after the liberation, camped at the mountain of God. They were visited by Jethro, the priest of Midian. The chapter concludes with Moses allowing Jethro to return to his own country. If Mount Sinai were in Midian, why would Jethro need to make a journey back to his homeland? The last piece of biblical evidence is Paul's statement about Mount Sinai's location in Arabia. However, Paul may have been referring to Arabia Petrea. According to Manu Hubner in his book The Root of the Exodus, there are ancient writings where the name Arabia was also used to refer to the Sinai Peninsula until the 4th century. In fact, according to Herodotus, Pliny and Strabo, the region of Arabia extended from the Nile Delta right across to the Persian Gulf. Therefore, one can easily argue that the Apostle Paul used the 1st century Roman concept of Arabia in this passage. The physical evidence for this route isn't without fault either. The burnt rock on the top of Al-Lawz is a common misconception. The mountain with the charred top is actually Jabal Makla, which is 7 kilometers south of Jabal Al-Lawz. This is due to the dark-colored hornfels, a type of metamorphic rock that is formed from lava flows, a common feature along the Red Sea Rift and Jordan Valley. But what about the chariots and wheels found under the Gulf of Aqaba? Although the images do look fascinating, it is important to remember that no independent examination was ever conducted. Jose reiterates this point when he says that Mr. Ron Wyatt is neither an archaeologist nor has he ever carried out a legally licensed excavation. We are aware of his claims which border on the absurd, as they have no scientific basis whatsoever, nor have they ever been published in a professional journal. Therefore, the most convincing piece of evidence Wyatt put forth has to be the towering mountain range on the western shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, which could have trapped the Israelites, while the terrain around the Bitter Lakes is relatively flat in comparison. However, this point is not enough to make a substantial argument on its own. There are many other pieces of physical evidence that could be discussed, such as the cave markings on the foot of the mountain or the split rock, but they all fall under the same conclusion. Wyatt is not an archaeologist, but rather a nurse anesthetist, which means his discoveries would need to be interpreted by a trained professional. But as mentioned before, this simply hasn't happened. As one archaeologist concluded, his work was 10% excavation and 90% interpretation. The Bible states that after crossing the Red Sea, the Israelites traveled through 3 different wildernesses before reaching Mount Sinai. If Mount Sinai were located at Jebel Al-Lawz, just 80 kilometers from the Gulf of Aqaba, the short distance would have to account for 3 distinct wilderness regions, an unlikely scenario. In contrast, the journey from a possible Red Sea crossing at the Bitter Lakes to Jebel Musa spans approximately 250 kilometers. This longer route is more plausibly divided into 3 separate wildernesses, aligning better with the biblical description. Now, let's have a look at the crossing. The Gulf of Aqaba lies between the Dead Sea Transform Fault and the Jordan Rift Valley, creating a seabed with deep canyons that reach depths of 2,000 meters below sea level. While Ron Wyatt suggested that underwater land bridges might have provided crossing points, even these bridges would still place the seafloor at around 850 meters below sea level in the center, a challenging passage. By contrast, the Sus region has a seabed that is much shallower, reaching depths of only about 40 meters, with gentle slopes on both sides. This terrain would have been far more suitable for the Israelites to cross on foot. Josephus describes the seabed as a new road through the seas, and Psalm 106 compares it to a desert. Between the two locations, the northern Suez crossing appears to be the more reasonable choice, but one could argue, if this is the case, why is there no evidence in the Sinai desert to show for it? According to K.A. Kitchen, a British Egyptianologist, to find no trace of ever-moving camps in the Sinai desert is entirely correct. After all, the Israelites were a nomadic people dwelling in tents, and considering the event took place 3,000 years ago, it is no surprise there is no physical evidence. While no route can be confirmed with absolute certainty, the traditional Sinai route remains the most plausible based on biblical, geographical, and logistical evidence. Jebel Musa, towering over the Sinai landscape, aligns best with ancient descriptions of Mount Sinai. The Bitter Lakes offers a more practical location for the Red Sea crossing, with shallower waters and historical context supporting a route through the Sinai Peninsula rather than Saudi Arabia, in this miraculous journey of faith and deliverance.